Ladies and gentlemen, and my name is Paolo von Schirach. I am privileged to serve as president of the Global Policy Institute, an independent think tank here in Washington, D.C., and as chair of political science and international relations at Bay Atlantic University. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this event, which is meant to commemorate the unfortunate circumstances of the attempted and failed coup d'etat back in 2016 in Turkey. And there's been, a lot of, how can I say, discussion, not only what happened in Turkey then, but also on the ripple effects of those events in the bilateral US-Turkey relationship. And this is going to be a part of our conversation today. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker, and that is His Excellency Mr. Serdar Kilic, the Turkish ambassador to the United States of America, and a good friend of Bay Atlantic University and the Global Policy Institute, I should say. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you, Paolo. First of all, I should like to thank Global Policy Institute, Bay Atlantic University, to you personally, of course, not only as a good friend, but as an able leader, decision shaper in Washington, D.C., that is cognizant of all the developments pertaining to Turkish-American relations and the realities in Turkey. I would like to thank you in that regard. I would like to thank Sinem Hanım as well for her contributions to today's event. I would like to welcome Robert Amsterdam and Ergin Paşam, hoş geldiniz, sefalar getirdiniz. Well, I mean, maybe I should start by setting the record straight as far as what happened on the 15th of July in Turkey and how we came to that point. On the 15th of July, 4 years ago, exactly on this day, a group of rogue army officers, by making use of the weapons given to them by the Turkish army and by the Turkish nation, took to the streets. They attacked state institutions, state structures, and they tried to overthrow the democratically elected government in Turkey and to get control of the state, the Turkish state, and disrupt the Turkish democracy. But thank God, the Turkish people, upon the call of President Erdogan, took to the streets and defended their democracy, their country, future of their country, and also their democratically elected leaders. This is maybe the main difference between the previous coup attempts in Turkey, successful or not, and the 15th of July. Let me highlight a couple of distinctions in that regard between 15th of July and the previous coup attempts in Turkey. The previous coup attempts were conducted in the chain of command with the participation of all segments of the Turkish armed forces. On the 15th of July, the Turkish armed forces, or the elements that have participated in the terrorist coup attempt, were under the control of civilians. Civilians defined as imams in the Fethullah Gülen terrorist organization. If you take a look at the persons that were apprehended at the headquarters of the coup plotters on the 15th of July, namely the Akıncı Air Base, there were Adil Öksüz. He was the imam of the armed forces. Kemal Batmaz, he was the imam of the Turkish Air Forces. Hakan Çiçek, he was the imam of the land army, land forces. Harun Biniş, he was the imam of the Navy, and Nurettin Oruç, he was the imam of gendarmerie. All of them were apprehended at the Akıncı Air Base. And the coup plotters, during that night, there are video footages in that regard, they were saluting and they were taking direct instructions from those civilians. So that was one of the distinctions in that regard. Second, first time Turkish army officers or soldiers that have participated in the coup attempt opened fire on civilians. And on the 15th of July, the civilians did not have weapons in their hands. They just had Turkish flags, and they were trying to convince the rogue officers that have participated in the coup attempt that what they were doing was wrong. They were doing harm to the country. They were doing harm to the future of the country. And they were killed, 251 of them. Over 2,000 of Turkish citizens that took to the streets that night were wounded, some of them very seriously, and they are going to be crippled throughout their life because of the wounds that they were subjected to during that night. And maybe there is another important element that we should not lose sight of. 15th of July was not the first attempt of the terrorist organization, Fethullah Gülen terrorist organization, to overthrow or try to overthrow the Turkish government and to control the Turkish state. First, in 2013, between May and August, they tried a social coup, so to speak, if you would like to define like that. They initiated social unrest on the streets and hoped that it will ultimately result in the disruption of the Turkish system and that the Turkish government will be overthrown. But during the municipal elections 3 months later, the Turkish people gave their response to the initiative taken in that regard. Second, there was an attempt by making use of legal system in Turkey, also with the assistance of the security forces. On the 17th and 25th of December, with forged documents, fabricated evidences, they tried to overthrow the Turkish government as well. Of course, at the end of the day, as I mentioned before, the response was given by the Turkish people at the municipal elections conducted in 2014 in March. The military coup attempt on the 15th of July was the third attempt in that regard to overthrow the Turkish government and to get control of the state structures. Who participated in the coup attempt in that regard? The rogue officers in the Turkish army. Today, we have one of the most respected commanders of the Turkish army with us, General Ergin Saygun. He is one of the officers that I had the pleasure of working with, participating in meetings, and I always admired the way he defended Turkey's rights and Turkey's expectations at the international meetings, and also he suffered a lot. Why? Because he was loyal to the Turkish state, he was loyal to the Turkish government, and he was loyal to the Turkish flag. All of those officers that adopted a similar stance in the Turkish army somehow were subjected to legal proceedings, and they were unfortunately taken out of the army. And they were replaced by the rogue army officers that have participated in the 15th of July coup attempt. I am sure General Saygun will give ample information in that regard, because he personally suffered at the hands of the judges and prosecutors that have their loyalty bestowed upon to the person living in Pennsylvania. Having said all these on the 15th of July, I should like to highlight what we expect from the US government, because since the leader of that Fethullah Gülen terrorist organization is residing in the United States, of course, the Turkish people, not only the Turkish government, have high expectations from the United States in that regard. Actually, we expect the United States to abide by the rules and regulations, letter and spirit of the agreement that we have signed with the United States in 1979 on the extradition of those kind of persons. And we have delivered to US authorities, submitted to US authorities, 85 boxes of documents and evidence. That has substantiated the basis or the role of Fethullah Gülen and his organization on the 15th of July terrorist coup attempt in Turkey. They are still working on those documents, and unfortunately, so far, we did not receive the positive response from the response that we have expected from the US authorities. But let alone what he has done in Turkey prior to 15th of July, during the 15th of July, and maybe still, but there are also things that he is doing in the United States that the US authorities should be more concerned. The Fethullah Gülen terrorist organization is running 180, roughly, around 180 charter schools in the United States. And he is collecting on an annual basis 850 million US dollars from the US taxpayers' money. So actually, as a matter of fact, I am sorry to put it that way, but the American people, American taxpayers, unwillingly financed the military coup in Turkey on the 15th of July. And they are still financing the terrorist organization unwillingly. They don't know that they are supporting a terrorist organization. But we have given ample information, as I told you, to US authorities in that regard to act upon. And I hope that sooner than later, the US authorities are going to come to terms and they are going to take action as far as his activities on the 15th of July and before in Turkey, but also as far as his activities in the United States are concerned, tax evasion, H-1B visa irregularities, bringing teachers to charter schools from United States, and money laundering and illegal transfer of funds from Turkey to the schools in the United States. We have given ample information in that regard as well to the US authorities. So I hope that the US authorities are going to take necessary action, and at least we are going to clear an important item from our bilateral agenda. Thank you very much, Sinem Hanım. I will try to stop here, and I will let General Saygun and Robert Amsterdam to share their views with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. And you created a framework for us to discuss, to dig into, with the help of our two distinguished participants. I would like to welcome you all as the president of Bay Atlantic University. And I would like to continue from where you ended, actually. We have two distinguished participants, Paşam, the retired general who served in the Turkish military for a long time, who served under Turkish military at various countries, who has an international experience as well, and who knows the relationships between Turkey and America as two strong NATO allies, and also Mr. Amsterdam, who have been working on Gülen case in the US for the Turkish government, and also published a book on Gülen movement that Mr. Ambassador summarized. But I would like Mr. Amsterdam to dig into that issue, the charter school issue in the US, in a bit. So those two distinguished panelists and the detailed resumes, detailed background of them could be found in the email invitation. So using the time effectively, I will not go into detail, but I would like to, we have many international participants, as you can see, you know, we have around 4 to 6 attendees now, and many of them may not know who Gülen is. Some, I checked, you know, the names, maybe some lived in Turkey for some time, they are familiar with who Fethullah Gülen and this, you know, the story of this movement that started as a religious movement, but then it turned out to be an international terrorist organization. So I would like to first ask Paşam, General Ergin Saygun, to tell us about his experience. I know this is not a very pleasant one. I mean, you've had some unpleasant time experience with this terrorist organization, being framed by them and then being even convicted to, as far as I remember, an 18-year of prison time. But due to your health issues, you did not serve. But right after that, you know, this coup attempt happened. And now we know how you were framed by them. But for the international audience, this doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, Mr. Ambassador said at the beginning, on July the 15th, how a group of people in the military tried to take over the control. But how did we come to that point as the Turkish military? Could you please give an idea about what happened in the Turkish military so that the audience, our international audience, could make a better sense of our experience?
Thank you very much, first, for including me in this webinar. And I would like to especially thank to His Excellency Turkish Ambassador for his very kind words. I think what happened in Turkey is a long story, but how we came to what happened to Turkey is another issue. As Mr. Ambassador said Fethullah Gülen is living in this country for 11 years, and he's been granted residence status for health, for health treatment, medical treatment. But of course, this is not quite true, because now he runs a huge empire of trade, commercial issues, and magazines and corporations, schools all around the world. He runs about 600 schools, as far as I know. Only, as the ambassador said, in the United States is 180. Why? What is his status? Why he has such a privileged status in the United States? For instance, he supports congressional candidates like Hillary Clinton. Their election campaigns, he donates money, quite a lot of money. We are talking about millions of dollars. How he earns this money and how much tax does he pay in the United States? To make a long story short, why is he protected? This is, I think, an important question. Why the US government allowed him to make what he did in Turkey? I think it was Senator Welch, just 2 days after the 15th of attempted coup, 15th of July, he said, Gülen is a victim of US policies. Now, this is a very ambitious sentence, and in fact, I think that is what happened. Now, he's still doing what he's doing, but maybe not as good as he was maybe 5 years ago. But it is not finished. It is, he will still continue to do, to complete his mission. Now, what is his mission in the United States, of course, is unknown to me. But I think if I can speak for another 3-4 minutes, I would like to say that religion has always been a very practical tool in US foreign policy. This, I think, started, as far as I know, in 1994-95 with the emergence of moderate Islam. The idea was if you increase moderate Islam, you will reduce fanatic Islam or fundamentalist Islam. Well, it didn't work out that way, but in the 1990s, there was an approach from the US administration to what they thought was moderate Islam organizations. The one I remember is Supreme Islamic Council of America, run by Rabbani Haqqani. We know him as Sheikh Nazım Kıbrısi, and many others. Of course, there are also news that in the Central Asian, in some of his schools in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, 130 CIA officers were working. Now, some say this is not true, but I think Fethullah Gülen was a useful tool also to infiltrate into the Central Asian republics. Now, what is the situation now? Of course, as the ambassador said, I think there is a problem with his extradition to Turkey. The US authorities say that he has won a legal case, so legally he has some rights to stay in the United States. But I think President Trump put the full stop, I think 2 years ago, when he said his extradition was not on the table or was not considered in that manner. Now, so this, everything started as a religious affair, and I think the US is still making a mistake by considering him as a religious figure, a clerk. He is not. As the ambassador said, he's the leader of a terrorist organization. So I think the US authorities will now consider the events of the 15th of July and think again, what good would it do for them to keep this man under protection? Now, how I personally was affected from this man, very, very shortly, the Gülenists have a long track record of framing their perceived opponents, engaging in judicial tricks, because they controlled key positions at the judiciary and the police. They mount targeted operations disguised as legal investigations. When I was the first army commander back in 2009, somebody told me that a 4-star general will be arrested. I said, was it me? He said, no, you will be arrested 6 months after you retire. And they missed the 6 months margin by just by a couple of days. And they put me in prison when I was receiving medical treatment in a hospital for serious heart problem. When I was in the prison, I was suffering from heart, lungs, kidney, high blood pressure, diabetics, vertigo, and a couple of others. But in the prison, they put me in a cell where I had to do all my medical requirements by myself, measure my blood sugar, so that decide on how much insulin should I make, and use machines for proper breathing and various other things. All I wanted was to have a proper medical treatment, which was denied. So I had to go to the European Court of Human Rights. Then I was put in a hospital, but the hospital wrote a report and said I should be discharged because the longer I stayed in the hospital, there was a problem of my heart problems with infection of the heart valve. The court said no, and that happened exactly what the hospital said, and I have to take a 3rd heart operation with a very slim chance of surviving, but fortunately I did. And so this, I'm not the only one, there are many others, because the death toll during all these trials and the prison term is about 13 or 14 people. They lost their wives in prison or while serving outside. Not only the officers themselves, but also their families. There were casualties from the family itself. So if we go back to, as you said, the fake trials with fake evidence, manufactured documents, all of us received heavy sentence. I was sentenced to 18 years, but then we were tried again, and the court decided that it was fake, all manufactured documents. So we were now we are set free. Why it happened? Of course, this is not something which happened instantly. It took years to build up. I would like to, if I can find it very, very quickly. You must move in the arteries of the system without anyone noticing your existence until you reach all the power sentence, and anything you do must seem to be legal. This is the instruction he gave to all his followers, and all these instructions were, this is exactly what they did. So I think this, at this moment, is all I have to say without taking too much of your time. But if things come to, again, to the using Islam on this issue, I might have a few other words to say.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for sharing, some of those unpleasant moments for you. I'm sorry that, I had that question to you, but it really would create a frame for the international audience, because that's really difficult for them to understand. As you said, nothing has happened instantly. Yeah. It took years for them to create that system, to go into the arteries of the judiciary, of the police forces, of the military. And, you know, they, in a way, framed many of our distinguished generals or other military officers like you yourself, so that they can place their own, you know, military people. And 4 years ago, on July the 15th, those were the ones that attempted this coup. And now I would like to switch to Mr. Amsterdam. So General Saygun summarized what happened in Turkey and how this terrorist organization works, what their mentality is, and how they operate. But how about the US? Because for me, as the president of an American university, but as a Turkish citizen who grew up in Turkey in a secular family and who have, you know, always thought about this group long time ago, you know, these are religious people and who are trying to misguide people, and we should keep ourselves away from these people. But why is it so difficult for the Americans to understand this point of view? Because we've experienced in Turkey that they all start their operations using education as a tool. And this is how they operate in the US, exactly the same way that they are starting schools, and then they are, you know, creating good connections with the local governments to affect people and to take them near them, and even, you know, supporting political figures to gain more political power. How do they operate in the US? You wrote a book on this. That's why I'm asking this question to you. How do they operate? And, you know, how can they still keep their schools open despite all the FBI investigations? Could you please, you know, share some statements so that the audience can also understand what's going on in the US? I think we lost Mr. Amsterdam right about he was starting to answer. We lost him, and let's wait for him to reconnect. If he does not reconnect, you know, in a few seconds, then I will ask my second question to General Saygun. Okay, so let's continue with you, General Saygun. I think he will be joining us again. Mr. Amsterdam, you said that you wanted to make further comments about how they use religion. Would you like to continue from where you left?
Yes, thank you very much. As I said, everything, as far as I know, started with the invention of the word moderate Islam. So there is a lot of benefit in using religion in a society which is basically very religious. For instance, I think it was in 1999 that first Religious Freedom Abroad report was published, and it still goes on. Now, I think the United States accepted Gülen as one of the moderate Islam organizations, and they gave them their support because they think Gülen movement could be managed in the right way to suit America's purposes. As I said, in mid-1990s, in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, there were allegations that there are CIA agents in Gülen schools. For instance, the US immigration authorities want to extradite him in 2006, I think it was, but Graham Fuller, the CIA station chief in Kabul, Afghanistan, and Norton Abramovich, one of the US ambassadors in Ankara, provided reference for him to stay in the United States. So I'm telling all these that he is considered as a religious figure who can help the US reach out to countries where religion is a major factor, which was wrong, of course, because I hope that they understood now that he is not the religious man that they were hoping he is. So the 15th of July coup attempted and failed coup showed that he will not, this organization will not hesitate to take all the risks to change the regime of a country, no matter what the cost. This should be a clear warning also to the maybe United States. I'm not saying he's trying to change the regime in the United States, but in the countries they operate, there is always a danger that they reach out their hands for further things. Will he be extradited? Mr. Ambassador said that there is a treaty between US and the Turkey about extradition and mutual assistance, but apparently it doesn't work at the moment. Religion is getting more and more popular. For instance, there is the issue of Saint Sophia in Turkey now. It's open to for prayers, and even the United States says, "Don't do it." I mean, why shouldn't we do it? It's a place within the boundaries of the state of Turkey. But religion, as I said, has always been a key point. One interesting thing here is the US is so much interested in the moderate Islam, but on the other hand, they work hand in hand with the terrorist organizations which use Islam. For instance, Taliban. For instance, the US provided weapons for the Taliban to fight against the Russians in Afghanistan, and then they had to buy them back. Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden was operated in one of the Gulf states, and the local CIA man visited him to get well soon visit. It was President Trump. He said that Daesh, ISIL, whatever their name is, was formed by Barack Obama. Now, these are things, on one side, you work for moderate Islam, but on the other hand, you are trying to raise radical Islam. So I think this is a clash of interests between the various agencies in the US system. This is all I have to say at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So you positioned the leader of this terrorist organization, Fethullah Gülen, as someone that has been used by the, several US agencies, including CIA. But, and that is how he can have residency in the US now under protection. And despite Turkey's insistency, the US government does not extradite Gülen. I will have a question related with that, but let's, Mr. Amsterdam, I think your internet connection was lost and now you are back with us. Quickly, I'm going to repeat my question. How do they operate in the US? How do they establish all these schools? And despite all those FBI investigations, how can they still, keep their schools?
Well, look, we published, as you know, a 750-page book called Empire of Deceit, which laid out dozens of scams and frauds. It is very difficult to understand the reticence of American regulators, local, state, and federal, to engage directly with the organization. I will tell you, as is obvious, there are ongoing FBI investigations. In addition, the present situation, the pandemic, has brought out the worst in these schools. Because we've identified so many of them engaged in financial fraud, We've been looking at their application under the CARES Act and also under other pandemic relief programs. And like some other schools, not only are they double dipping, but they are engaging in the same type of fraudulent contact in terms of numbers of students, numbers of employees, and we're investigating all of this. Many of the teachers in these schools have been fired. Some of them have come to us and have given us statements and are working with us. But I think it's important for everyone to understand the Gulen organization and the way it carries on. It's almost unknown in terms of the United States. This mixture of religion and criminal fraud and the political power they seek, this is a very rare combination. You have terrorists who are often after discrete goals, but the Gulen organization, in its attempt to seize power, not only in Turkey, but in Africa, in Europe, in over 100 countries in which they're engaged, they represent a dramatic, in fact, you could say almost an existential crisis in respect to how they are controlled. Because exactly as the general said, they attempt to mask constantly what their true motives are. They present themselves not as terrorists, but as educators. They run a dual state program. In other words, they have individuals in their schools, many of whom are Turkish, who have already changed their names to Americanize them, and they attempt to fit in with the local community without ever sharing the fact that money is skimmed to the regional imams. All of the Turkish teachers are tithing 40% of their salaries back. Many of these Turkish individuals who have been involved in the largest H-1B visa fraud in the history of the United States are being trafficked. Literally, the Gulen organization's engaging in human trafficking. And yet, still, we are having a tremendously difficult time convincing Americans of the danger because, frankly, with their various front organizations, Turquoise, Niagara, et al., they spend a lot of time meeting with and attempting to influence American, local, and regional politicians. They photobomb the President of the United States. They hire very expensive PR and others to attempt to portray Gulen as a political opponent of the Turkish government. He is not a political opponent. There is no political party in Turkey that would ever support Fethullah Gulen. He does not operate as a politician. He is a liar, he is a thief, and quite honestly, he, in fairness to the US government, they virtually said that in court. They tried to deny him his stay in the United States at one point, and they basically said that Fethullah Gulen is not a world-renowned educator, that he's created his own image and reputation by capturing the academic community and then having his own echo chamber recreate his praise. I mean, he is very sophisticated. The general has spoken, and it's true, of their very close relationship to the Clintons, which you can see on YouTube. It is not a rumor. It is, I believe, certainly from our investigations, very clear that there was a relationship between Gulen and certain organs of the United States government because it was believed that Gulen schools in Central Asia could be penetrated and agents could be placed in situ there. And that relationship helped spawn some of the cover he has. Because I will tell you, the way in which the schools are organized in the United States reflects a sophisticated knowledge of local politics that virtually no foreigner could even attempt to understand. So
interrupt at that point. I guess this is one of the main reasons that Russia closed all their schools and banned, this organization to operate in, the Russian Federation, right? I think they closed all their schools back in 2001 or 2, claiming that these schools were, spy organizations.
Well, and in fact, it's not just the Russians. Dexter Filkins wrote a brilliant piece in the New Yorker that alluded to a lot of this as well. What I think should really be underscored is that academics post-2016 are now understanding this double role of Gulen. There was a very erudite magazine in Europe that came out with a special edition on Gulen just recently, where they identified him not as a religious leader, but as an exemplar of what they call parapolitics, an organization dedicated to seizing power, but unwilling in any way to participate in public debate or dialogue. And it is incredibly important for the United States to seize the initiative, and I'm not just talking about extradition, I'm talking about the involvement of this organization in American politics itself. We had this Russian investigation, but quite frankly, the Gulenists are invading American politics at the local level very effectively. They are also one of the largest organizations that spawns anti-Semitism existing in the United States today. And when that comes out, they pretend they're involved in interfaith dialogue. But the people that we've had whistleblow on them have been very consistent about what the true beliefs are of these individuals, particularly those at the top, this circle of disciples that live and work around the compound in Saylorsburg.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Amsterdam. So these initial questions, with the help of these initial questions, I believe the audience, the participants, do now have a sense of how this organization works, not only in Turkey, but in an international arena, and especially in the US, using the schools as their coverage disguise. But let's come back to the main issue. The panel discussion. We invited you all to discuss what's going on between the relationships of Turkey and America. These two countries are long-time NATO allies, but this failed coup attempt somehow has not been recognized by our US allies in the way that Turkey would expect. I'm sorry, sometimes I'm using, we, because, I'm a Turkish citizen and maybe I'm a little bit biased, even though, this is not a panel discussion where we have some biased opinions, but forgive me when I use the term we sometimes. But let's discuss what's going on between the relationships of the two countries with this framework of how Gulen worked and maybe how he caused a tension between these two longtime friends, NATO allies. First, let me ask to General Saygun. Right now, Washington and Ankara relations, despite a relatively warm personal rapport between the two presidents, they are not good. Beyond the bitterness created by the lack of support for the Turkish government after this attempted coup, there are other issues complicating the relationships, and many of them are military related. From US support to the Kurds in Syria, to the Turkish purchase of the S-400s, and now support by the Washington of the Greece-Cyprus-Israel coalition in the Eastern Mediterranean that Ankara views as exclusionary and biased. So many things, but many of these issues are actually caused by this tension created by Gulen. I mean, recognizing him as the leader of the terrorist organization or not, and extraditing him to Turkey or not. As a retired general who served in several countries like Brussels, Korea, and someone who experienced these strong ties between Turkey and America as NATO allies, what do you think could be done to ease these tensions and create a more relaxed relationship atmosphere between these two long-time NATO allies?
Thank you very much. The issue is very complex. There are many issues which have built up over the past years. Now, there's a tendency in the United States to use pressure, political pressure, even threats, to achieve its political objectives. Do this, otherwise I will do this sort of thing. Now, it is, we call arm twisting or threatening. This is a main issue for not reaching to an agreement. There are certain issues which the United States cannot move backwards. In order to reach an agreement, you must sit down at a table and discuss things, but this is not the case. For instance, I will not go all the way back, but we have some very bitter memories, like in 1964, when we received a letter from the United States directed to the Prime Minister of Turkey, saying that you cannot use US weapons to intervene in Cyprus. They were given to you for NATO purposes. Exactly the same thing happened almost 50 years later. For instance, in Syria, in northern Iraq, YPG and PYD, they are terrorists, but US says, no, this is our ground troops, and they are not terrorists. And they're supplying, the US is supplying these terrorists with thousands of trucks load of ammunition, sophisticated weapons. There are issues, for instance, now Eastern Mediterranean. Stop searching for oil or gas. Or there is an issue now of Libya. So all of these conflicting interests, unfortunately, do not allow Turkey and US sit at a negotiating table. Now, to be a little bit maybe biased, as you said, myself, the United States doesn't want a strong Turkey in this region, because the US considers itself having responsibilities towards the Greeks, the Armenians, the Kurds, the Jews, OIV. So a regional power as Turkey, as a regional power, will not be happy with what is going on around it. So United States, I think, wants to control Turkey. Turkey can be a regional power if it follows a line with the US policies. Otherwise, this clash will continue. This is all, I think, if it is enough. I can go on, but I think this is enough.
I think that's enough for the time being, because I have some questions from the audience as well, but thank you very much. So the similar question now I have for Mr. Amsterdam. General Saigon shared his views considering the military relationships between the two countries, and you as an international lawyer, why do you think Washington somehow fails to understand the seriousness of these dramatic events? And why is it that the US government, despite the evidence presented by Ankara, is not allowing the extradition of Gülen? And do you see any window that it could happen? This is actually one of the questions asked by one of our participants, Mary. Do you think that's going to happen anytime soon?
Look, firstly, as I've said for many years, I won't comment on timing in respect to extradition. This is a matter that is a state-to-state matter, and I'm not going to impose my views. In respect to the Gulen organization itself and stopping their theft of American taxpayer money, I believe that is starting. I think we are starting to see an impact. I think the expansion of some of these schools now has been stopped, not all of them, but some of them, thankfully. And that will continue as more information is put out and more individuals realize as well that the Gulen schools in the United States target the least fortunate. They target the Black and Hispanic poor, and they extract massive amounts of Title VII money that is not used for their benefit often. And what's happened with special needs children throughout the United States in these schools is frankly horrific. On the broader issues of Turkey and the United States, number one, I think we all need to understand that the United States State Department right now is operating in a way that is different than it has operated in prior administrations. A lot more foreign policy is being dealt with in the White House as opposed to at state. And I believe the future for the Turkish-American relationship is actually quite positive. Turkey has a tremendous amount of regional weight that needs to be addressed properly by the United States, especially if the United States continues to engage in more of its isolationist impulse and remove itself from the Middle East and remove itself from many of the territories in which Turkey is heavily engaged. And I think one of the things Americans don't realize is how much American credibility has been lost in the Mideast as a whole. Not just putting this on President Trump, but putting it on President Obama in terms of how Syria was handled. Turkey took in 4 million refugees that would have been left to rot were it not for the incredible generosity of the Turkish people. And yet, rather than having that massive step being applauded, Turkey continues to find itself in problems with the EU and in problems with the United States. But I do sense a change is in the offing. Obviously, these are, this touches on issues like the Russian missile purchase or whatnot that I'm not going to speak about. But the fact of the matter is that Turkey, under President Erdogan, has played a very strong hand recently in the Middle East and has taken the kinds of steps that are necessary for the defense of the Turkish homeland. And that needs to be understood by the American people. If the United States, God forbid, was in the kind of neighborhood that Turkey was, believe me, there would be a necessity for a very different type of foreign policy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amsterdam. And now that we have the privilege of hosting His Excellency Serdar Kılıç, the Turkish ambassador to the US, these last two questions I directed to our distinguished panelists, Mr. Ambassador. What do you think about the tension between the relationships of the US and Turkey, and how do you think we could have a smoother relationships that we used to have in the past?
Sinan, thank you very much. You used a good definition of Turkish-American relations. You said we are allies since 70 years now. But that cannot be an empty definition. Being ally entails certain responsibilities and certain actions that need to be taken vis-a-vis certain events. There needs to be cooperation, coordination, consultation, solidarity, mutual understanding, and most importantly, empathy. What happened on the 15th of July was a disgrace in that regard. Unfortunately, I should admit that that was the most disappointing day of my life in Washington, D.C. as the Turkish ambassador. I was in this office and sitting on this very desk. And I had 5 telephone conversations with the White House. I told them that there was a developing military coup in Turkey, out of the chain of command, and that was conducted or tried to be conducted by a group of rogue army officers. And I reminded them that they were criticizing the Turkish democracy. They were claiming that the Turkish democracy was in erosion, and that there is a tendency of autocracy in Turkey. Mm-hmm. And I told them that the Turkish democracy that you are criticizing, you have been criticizing, is under a direct terrorist attack now. They are trying to overthrow the Turkish government. And now this is time for you to take your sides. Side with the democratic forces in Turkey. Side with the Turkish people that are trying to defend the democracy that you are criticizing, you have been criticizing. And what happened? After 5 telephone conversations, I couldn't be able to achieve a statement, a solid statement in support of the Turkish people, defending the Turkish democracy at the cost of their lives. There was just a statement concerning a telephone conversation between Secretary of State Kerry and President Obama. That's all. The day after, there was another statement by Secretary Kerry asking the parties, putting the coup plotters and the Turkish people defending Turkish democracy on an equal footing. That was a big disappointment, I should say. The word of condemnation only came 4 days after the coup attempt in Turkey. 4 days. A month later, Vice President Pence visited Turkey and he apologized. And he should have apologized. But that resulted in, unfortunately, a developing distrust on the part of the Turkish people vis-à-vis the United States and the United States approach to Turkey. Fethullah Gülen is a poisoning effect on Turkish-American relations. But Fethullah Gülen is not only agenda item that's poisoning the Turkish-American relations. General Ergin Saygun have mentioned the US support to the YPG-PYD in Syria. Unfortunately, you made the same mistake that is common in Washington, D.C. You mentioned the US support to the Kurds in Syria. The US is not supporting the Kurds, it's supporting a terrorist organization, YPG-PYD PKK in Syria. If it was the support to the Kurds, Turkey is the leading country in that regard. We are hosting 300,000 Kurds that escaped from the atrocities of Daesh and YPG-PYD, for that matter, to Turkey. And they are still residing in Turkey. And they cannot return back to Syria. Why? Because YPG-PYD is not allowing any Kurd to return back to Syria as long as they do not support the political ideology of YPG-PYD. And S-400s, was that the first choice of Turkey to buy S-400s? It's a big issue in the US Congress now. We were forced to buy S-400s because we needed urgently air defense systems. As Robert Amsterdam has mentioned, I mean, the United States is living in a different neighborhood. If we had neighbors like Canada and Mexico, things would have been much different. But we needed air defense systems and we needed them urgently. But the United States, again, did not treat Turkey as an ally. It treated Turkey as yet another customer that it can make profits. That shouldn't be the way the United States should have acted. So, I mean, if we can somehow leave Congress out of the picture, because the Congress, unfortunately, at least now, are acting under the pressure or the guidance of certain lobby groups and interest groups in the United States. Take a look at the decisions on the so-called Armenian genocide, let alone the fact that the resolution is adopted. It was adopted on the 29th of October, on the National Day of Turkey. That's a good indication in that regard. And we should somehow control the prejudice, not only in the Congress, but in the press as well. I will give you a striking example. You remember the Chinese citizen standing in front of the tank columns in Tiananmen Square? I will give you the headlines in New York Times in that regard. 30 years after Tiananmen, they say, he has become a global symbol of freedom and defiance, immortalized in photos, television shows, posters, and t-shirts. Why? Because he stood single-handedly in front of a tank column. He tried to defend the Chinese people, right? One person. Turkey has lost 251 of its citizens in defense of Turkish democracy. And what was the headline of New York Times? The Erdogan supporters are sheep and they will follow whatever he says. This was the headline of New York Times. So the people, they answered to the call of the president, they took to the streets, they defended the Turkish democracy that was criticized on a daily basis in the US press, and they were criticized as being a sheep, obeying the orders of President Erdogan. So this is the environment that we are functioning in the United States. I really appreciate what Robert Amsterdam is doing. At the end of the day, I hope his efforts is going to raise the awareness of the Fethullah Gülen terrorist organization in the United States, what they are doing actually to the US systems. If the United States is shying away from taking action against Fethullah Gülen, as far as what he has done in Turkey, at least they have to take concrete action in order to stop his activities that are poisoning the US system, financial, visa, and other systems, education in the United States. So I hope that at the end of the day, people in the United States that are cognizant of the importance of Turkey and that are cognizant of the importance of Turkish-American relations are going to realize that United States needs Turkey as much as Turkey needs United States. And the Turkish-American alliance relationship is as relevant as ever, as important as ever. And supporting Turkish-American relations and supporting Turkey in the long run is actually supporting the United States strategic interest in the region. You cannot defend United States strategic objectives in the region by depending on a terrorist organization like YPG-PYD. You have an ally over there, an old ally, 70-year-old ally that you can depend, that has a democratic system, and that has the second largest army in the United States. I hope those that are friends of Turkey, that are friends of Turkish-American relations in the future will be more vocal. And I hope that President Trump, he has a very good understanding with President Erdogan, is going to contribute a lot in that regard to the Turkish-American relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. So actually, these tensions, there is a chance that these tensions could be over when the US side at least shows some empathy to how Turkey has suffered and maybe has also recognized what Gülen created in Turkey as a system, and what Turkey is expecting actually is a recognition. And this is what I understand as a summary of our panelists and our keynote speaker, His Excellency. Now it's 3:11. I don't want to take too much of your time. I would like to, go back to our panelists and ask if they have some final remarks that they would like to share, because I believe we've had some questions, but both Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Amsterdam, and General Saygun answered, I guess, those questions already asked. But if I could have your final remarks, and then I'm going to end this panel discussion. Mr. Amsterdam,
yes,
we could start with you.
I want to just say, I want to speak personally for a minute. 4 years ago, I was in the ambassador's office when we were watching the bridge being closed in Istanbul. To this day, I, as an American, cannot understand this. We speak of this lack of empathy. I cannot understand why we are still 4 years later trying to convince people of Gülen's role. And I would refer any of these skeptics to the work of Professor Reynolds in the United States, as well now as dozens of others who have made very clear, as Ambassador Jeffries did the day of the coup, that the only organization that could do this was the Gülen organization, and that the Gülen organization is an inherently hierarchical organization. None of this could have been done without the direct knowledge of Fethullah Gülen. But furthermore, I am going to urge the Turkish government to go to the new UN Committee on Counterterrorism and file a demand for other governments who have and hosted organizations such as the Rumi Forum or the Dialogue in London to demonstrate to Turkey what they are doing with respect to the war on terror, to control and bring to justice many hundreds, if not thousands, of Gulenists who have left Turkey, entered these countries under false premises, and attempted to portray Gulen as some form of political opponent as opposed to the type of terrorist organization that they are. I think that's incredibly important. And I want to also state our firm is coming out now shortly with book 2 of Empire of Deceit, which not only addresses the schools, but addresses their incredibly aggressive political activities in the United States through these sophisticated front organizations and interdisciplinary think tanks, such as the Rumi Forum in Washington, that is used consistently to host thought leaders and engage in this intellectual capture that Gulen has been very effective in doing. But thank you very much for allowing me to attend. Once again, I'm so privileged to be on the panel with both His Excellency and General Saigun. So thank you so much for this privilege.
Thank you, Mr. Amsterdam. General Saigun, could I have your final remarks, please?
Yes, thank you. Very briefly, I would like to say a few words on Turkish-American relations. I will not go into detail, but last year, a poll made by one of the universities in Istanbul showed that 81.3% of the Turkish population consider the United States as the biggest threat to our country. This is incredible, but that's what it is. Now, this was 35% in 2015 and 60% 2 years ago. So something is wrong. The US is doing something wrong. We are allies, but we need to be friends. If the US wants to be friends with Turkey, then, for instance, you should not declare us as an adversary. Or President Trump shouldn't say, I will devastate your economy. It is incredible, but there are quite a lot of people in Turkey expecting an attack from the United States. Now, we didn't do this, the US did this. So I think it is time the US authorities should sit down and consider what is wrong and what is the main issues between us and the US. Thank you very much. It is a privilege for me to attend this webinar or this panel and I thank you and all the panelists for their contributions. I'm very honored to be with them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That honor is ours to host you. I would like to thank Mr. Paolo von Schirach, the director, the president of GPI, and Deniz Karataş for supporting Bay Atlantic University to organize this event. I would like to thank His Excellency and all the other distinguished panelists, Mr. Amsterdam and General Saigun, for allocating your time, and all the attendees, all the participants for following us. I think Deniz will be sending an email to you all shortly, sharing the link. So for those who have missed, they still have the chance to listen to our webinar. I think this is the end of it, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Our next event organized by GPI and BAU.
Thank you.
Thank you.